Hey guys. Tonight we slip into ancient Rome the way warm lamplight slips along marble, slow, golden, and a little too confident for something powered by oil and hope. You are standing on a street that still holds the day's heat. Even though the sun is gone, the stones under your sandals are polished by 1,000 years of feet. Carts, arguments, and dramatic exits. Somewhere nearby, a fountain keeps talking to itself. A vendor is packing away figs with the tired tenderness of someone who's done this since before you were born. And above you, on the dark slope of the Palatine, the houses of the powerful glow like quiet promises you are not allowed to touch. You can almost hear Rome breathing, an enormous animal settling down, pretending it's going to sleep, while still keeping one eye open for gossip, danger, and the next political surprise. This is the city where love can be a private ache and a public weapon at the exact same time. And tonight, you're going to follow a marriage that lasts, really lasts, through all the noise, Augustus and Livia. The couple who somehow keeps walking forward while the world keeps changing its rules. Now, fair warning, you probably won't survive this, not because it's terrifying, but because by minute 20 you'll be so cozy you'll forget you even have a spine. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me where you're listening from and what your local time is right now, city, country, and the hour, because I love imagining this story drifting across time zones like a slow, sleepy messenger. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin by letting Rome guide you, because Rome always insists on being the main character. You stroll past shuttered shops where the wooden doors still smell faintly of olive oil and smoke. You pass a doorway painted with a simple charm, something to ward off bad luck, and you try not to judge. Because in this city even the most powerful people will consult a bird, a dream, or a suspiciously confident priest before making a decision. If your modern brain wants to roll its eyes, go ahead, just do it quietly. The stones have heard worse. A patrol of night watchmen, vigiles, moves by with measured steps. Their lantern swings, tossing soft circles of light across the walls. The city's nighttime rules are simple. Keep your flame controlled. Keep your voice down, and try not to catch anything on fire. Rome has a long, intimate relationship with fire, and it's not the cute candlelit dinner kind. You breathe in and taste charcoal in the air, as if yesterday's cooking fires never fully left. You turn a corner and find yourself near the Forum. Quieter now but not silent. Even at night, it feels like a room where arguments are still lingering in the corners. You can almost see the day's speeches hanging in the air like smoke that refuses to disperse. This is where reputations are built, dismantled, rebuilt, and then immediately dismantled again, like an ancient version of refreshing your feed and regretting it. And somewhere beyond this, above this, wrapped in layers of privilege and security, the world of Augustus and Livia waits, not as a fairy tale, not as a dramatic, swooning epic, more like a long, steady candle flame that keeps burning while everyone else is busy setting curtains on fire. Here's the mainstream historical facts you carry like a lantern. Augustus, born Gaius Octavius, later called Octavian, emerges from Rome's civil wars as the single most powerful man in the Roman world and becomes its first emperor in all but name, shaping the Principate and redefining what republic even means. You don't need a dusty lecture for that. You can feel it in the way people lower their voices when his name is mentioned. Even when he isn't in the room, Rome has learned to speak softly around power. But tonight isn't only about power. It's about the daily, human machinery that keeps power from collapsing under its own weight. It's about two people, one man who learns to wear authority like a carefully tailored cloak, and one woman who learns to move through the palace like water through stone, patient, persistent, impossible to pin down. You drift toward the Palatine slope, where the air changes. It's quieter, cleaner, as if the city's chaos politely stops at the edge of elite property lines. Funny how that works in every century, right? You imagine the household not as a museum display but as a living space. The soft scuff of sandals on mosaic floors. The hush of servants who have mastered the art of being invisible. The faint scent of beeswax on wood. The cool touch of marble at night. You think about marriage in this world, how it's rarely just about affection and almost always about alliances. Inheritance, optics, love exists, Yes, but it wears a disguise. It slips between formal dinners and political favors. It hides inside a glance held a second too long. And if you're waiting for violins, you're in the wrong empire. Still, endurance, real endurance, is strangely intimate. There is something deeply human about two people continuing to choose the same household day after day. Through rumors and reforms and shifting loyalties. Through public ceremonies and private irritations. Through the kind of long partnership where you know the other person's habits so well you can predict them the way sailors predict tides. That's the kind of love story that sneaks up on you. It doesn't shout, it stays. You pause, letting the night settle over you like a cloak. Somewhere, a dog barks once, then decides the effort isn't worth it. A distant laugh rises and fades. You picture the city as it is right now. Thousands of lives stacked together, workers, soldiers, senators, poets, mothers, thieves, dreamers, all of them orbiting the same center of gravity. And yes, you also picture the absurd little details that remind you these were real people. Not marble statues, like the fact that Romans sometimes cleaned their teeth with powders that could include ingredients you really don't want to know about. Let's just say if your toothpaste ever tries to be authentically Roman, you are allowed to call the police. Or the way beauty routines might involve things that sound like a dare, crocodile dung sunscreen. For example, which is a phrase you should never have to hear right before bed. And yet here we are. Don't worry, remember that crocodile dung sunscreen. You will, later, you'll have no choice. You keep walking, and your mind does that sleepy thing where it starts to stitch the past into something you can almost touch. You imagine Augustus in the quiet hours, before dawn. When Rome is most honest, reviewing messages, weighing decisions, practicing calm the way someone practices an instrument. You imagine Livia nearby, not always speaking, but always noticing. The kind of person who hears what isn't said. The kind of person who can read a room the way you read a weather forecast, carefully, practically, and with a small internal sigh when the storm is obvious to everyone but the loudest man. Historians still argue whether their relationship is primarily a political alliance that grows into genuine affection, or whether affection is there from the start and politics simply gives it a respectable uniform. And that debate matters, because it changes the flavor of everything, the glances, the letters, the long stretches of partnership that don't make it into official records. If you've ever tried to reconstruct someone's relationship from their public posts, you already understand the problem. Rome is basically the original, curated image. Just with more statues and fewer apologies. You reach a spot where you can look down over the city. Oil lamps flicker like low stars. The Tiber is a dark ribbon, barely reflecting anything. The soundscape is soft now. A distant cart. A murmured conversation. The faint clink of something metal. Someone locking up. Someone guarding. Someone still awake because Rome never fully sleeps. And you realize that this is where the story begins. Not with a wedding. Not with a proclamation. Not with a dramatic kiss in a thunderstorm. It begins with atmosphere. With a city that demands performance and punishes weakness. With two lives moving toward each other inside a machine that can crush people like an afterthought. You let your shoulders relax. You breathe slower. You keep your steps unhurried. Because tonight we're not sprinting through history, we're drifting. Rome is warm stone and lamplight. It's whispered deals and tired laughter. It's the soft scrape of sandals and the hush of power behind closed doors. And somewhere ahead, in this same living night, you're about to watch a marriage form and hold, quietly. Stubbornly, like a flame that refuses to go out. You keep walking, because Rome rewards momentum. If you stop too long, someone will either ask what you're plotting or assume you already lost. So you move forward into the earlier version of Augustus, back when he's still Octavian. Still learning how to keep his face calm while the ground shifts under him. You picture him younger than you expect. Because power ages people in reverse in the history books. He's not yet the marble figure with the carefully managed smile. He's a slight young man with sharp eyes. Recovering from illness. Surrounded by veterans who have seen more blood than philosophy. This is a mainstream historical fact that anchors everything. Octavian is Julius Caesar's adopted heir. Named in a will that detonates Roman politics. You feel the shockwave of it even now. One document, one name, and suddenly a teenager is standing in the blast radius of ambition. Rome doesn't ease you into leadership, it throws you in and waits to see if you drown. You imagine Octavian learning quickly that survival here means controlling not just armies, but narratives, especially narratives. You drift into a quieter street as the story tightens. Octavian learns early that appearing reasonable is more powerful than being loud. While others shout, he listens. While rivals posture, he counts. You can almost see him practicing patience like a physical exercise, holding still, breathing evenly, letting opponents overextend. It's not heroic in the movie sense. It's closer to watching someone win a chess match by refusing to rush. Which is impressive, but not exactly thrilling dinner conversation. And yet, this restraint becomes his signature. He frames himself as the restorer of tradition, the man who will put the Republic back together, even as he quietly rearranges it into something entirely new. If you squint, you can see the irony forming. If you squint harder, you can see the genius. Historians still argue whether Octavian believed his own rhetoric about restoring the Republic or whether it was always a carefully staged performance. You imagine him lying awake, staring at a ceiling, wondering how many layers of acting are too many before you forget where the real you went. The city watches him closely. Rome always watches. You pass a wall where someone has scratched a political slogan, ancient graffiti. Surprisingly familiar. If you've ever scrolled comments at 2 a.m., you already understand the tone. Supportive, vicious, confident, wrong. Octavian grows up inside this noise. He learns that public opinion is like weather, you can't stop it, but you can plan around it. He also learns that alliances matter more than affection, at least at first. Friendships are provisional, loyalty is negotiable, love, when it appears, has to survive all of that. And at this stage, love is a luxury he can't afford. You feel the weight of it in the way he structures his days, meetings, correspondence, military briefings, rituals. Even meals are strategic. Nothing is casual. Even relaxation feels scheduled. You wander past a closed bathhouse and imagine him there earlier, surrounded by steam and murmurs, listening more than speaking. Roman baths are social media with towels, everyone naked, everyone talking, nobody truly private. It's where reputations soften or harden. You picture Octavian absorbing it all, filing away who jokes, who complains, who avoids eye contact. He understands that power doesn't just live in decrees, it lives in rooms like that. Here's a quirky tidbit that sneaks in while you're not looking. Octavian is famously careful with his health. He suffers frequent illnesses and becomes almost obsessively attentive to routines, diet, rest, moderation. Not exactly the image of a swaggering conqueror. More like someone who knows his body is fragile and decides to build an empire with scheduling and self-control. If this were a modern productivity channel, he'd be insufferable, but effective, very effective. You sense how this temperament sets the stage for his future marriage. A man who values steadiness over spectacle is not looking for fireworks. He's looking for continuity. Someone who understands that silence can be a form of loyalty. Someone who won't panic when the room turns cold. At this point, he doesn't know Livia yet, not really, but the shape of the partnership he will need is already forming. Rome keeps testing him. Rivals fall, alliances shift, titles accumulate without him officially accepting the big one. That's another historical anchor. Octavian avoids calling himself king. Rome hates kings, so he becomes something subtler, princeps, first citizen. You can almost hear the careful wording, the kind of phrasing that sounds humble while rearranging the universe. If you've ever said, "I'm not in charge," while holding all the keys, you get it. As you move through the night, you notice how the city itself mirrors his strategy. Grand buildings rise slowly, laws are restored with revisions, traditions are celebrated, but tweaked, nothing abrupt, nothing too honest. It's a long game, and long games require long partnerships. Historians still argue whether Octavian's early emotional life leaves visible traces in his later marriage choices, or whether politics fully eclipses personal preference. There are hints, letters, reported habits, patterns of trust, but nothing definitive. That ambiguity becomes part of the story. Love here isn't loud, it's inferred. You pause near a shrine. Its lamp still burning. Someone has left a small offering, bread, maybe, or fruit. You think about faith in this world, not as doctrine, but as habit. Rituals repeated because they've always been repeated. Octavian understands this too. He leans into religious revival not just because he's pious, but because it stabilizes people. Familiar gods, familiar rhythms, comfort as policy. And yet, despite all this calculation, there's an undercurrent of loneliness. Power isolates. You imagine him surrounded by advisors, yet rarely unguarded. Everyone wants something. Everyone watches his reactions. There's a kind of exhaustion that comes with being constantly legible. You start to understand why. When the right person appears, someone who doesn't need explanations, who reads the subtext automatically, it matters more than poetry ever could. You keep that thought with you as you continue through the lamplit streets. Rome feels steadier now, as if acknowledging that this young man is not going away. The noise softens around his presence. The chaos reorganizes, and somewhere ahead, a woman whose own life has been shaped by power, timing, and survival is moving toward him from a different direction. You don't rush. This story doesn't reward rushing. You let the city breathe. You let the night stretch. You remember that endurance is built quietly, one careful decision at a time. And you sense that before love settles into routine, it must first survive ambition. You feel the shift before you see her. Because Rome announces certain people the way weather announces itself, subtle pressure change. A collective pause. Livia enters your awareness not with spectacle, but with alignment. She fits the room. That's the unsettling part. In a city crowded with ambition and ornament, she moves like someone who already knows where the walls are. You notice how conversations angle toward her, how eyes track her without staring. She doesn't rush. She doesn't hover. She understands timing the way experienced gamblers understand cards. This is the mainstream historical fact grounding the moment. Livia Drusilla comes from an old, respected Roman family, already married to Tiberius Claudius Nero, already pregnant with her second child. She is not a blank slate, not a damsel waiting for destiny. She is a participant in Rome's political bloodstream. When you imagine her, you don't imagine silk drama, you imagine composure. You imagine someone who has learned that survival in Rome depends less on volume and more on placement. You pass through a reception, low voices, controlled laughter, the faint clink of cups, and you watch Livia navigate it with minimal effort. She listens more than she speaks, and when she does speak, she offers just enough. You recognize the technique. It's the same one Octavian uses, just tuned to a different register. If power were music, these two would be playing variations on the same theme, each hearing the other before the audience does. There's an open scholarly debate here that never quite settles. Historians still argue whether their attraction is immediate or whether it's a recognition of utility that later softens into affection. You feel the ambiguity because it feels human. Sometimes you notice someone first as a solution, and only later as a person. Sometimes it's the reverse. Rome doesn't leave neat paper trails for feelings, only for consequences. You imagine the first conversations, measured, polite, layered, no declarations, no cinematic pauses, just careful exchanges where every word is weighed for how it might echo. Livia is aware of her position, of the scandal potential, of the risks. She is also aware of Octavian's trajectory. You sense the calculation. Yes, but calculation here isn't cold. It's competent. In a city where incompetence gets people killed, competence is attractive. A quirky tidbit slips in while you're watching. Roman elite women, especially those like Livia, often manage household finances, estates, and social networks with impressive autonomy. This isn't a society where women hold formal office, but it is one where influence flows through dinner invitations, patronage, and kinship webs. Livia knows how to move resources without announcing it. If this were a modern setting, she'd be running 3 group chats and never posting. You notice how she dresses, not flashy, not severe, deliberately moderate. It's a look that signals virtue without shouting it, tradition without stiffness. Later, this style becomes almost iconic, but right now it's simply effective. You think about how appearances work in Rome. Too much ornament reads as excess, too little as neglect. Livia threads that needle daily. It's exhausting, but she makes it look natural. You catch fragments of rumor. Because Rome leaks, people whisper about the pregnancy, about the marriage, about who owes whom what. You realize that Livia is already used to this. She has lived under scrutiny long enough to know that you can't silence it. You can only outlast it. Endurance. Again, that theme keeps returning, like a refrain you didn't realize you were humming. You drift closer to Octavian's orbit and watch the two of them in proximity. Not touching, not signaling, just coexisting in a shared space with an ease that feels notable. You've seen forced alliances before, they crackle with tension. This doesn't. It hums. There's a mutual recognition of limits. Neither tries to dominate the other publicly. That restraint, in Rome, is a language of respect. Historians still argue whether Livia's intelligence and composure actively shape Octavian's later governance style or whether he simply finds in her a mirror of his own instincts. You can feel how the question matters. If she influences him, then the empire's shape shifts. If she merely reflects him, then the stability is self-generated. The truth is probably messier, and therefore more interesting. You imagine Livia at home, because that's where much of her power resides. Managing servants, overseeing accounts, maintaining the social rhythm that keeps elite households functioning. This is not trivial work. In Rome, a household is a political unit. Who visits, who is welcomed, who waits too long at the door, all of it sends signals. Livia reads those signals fluently. She doesn't need to announce decisions, she implements them quietly. There's a moment, no one records it. Because no one records moments like this, when you sense Octavian noticing the absence of friction. Conversations end cleanly, plans align without drama. It's like discovering that a door you've been bracing yourself against is actually unlocked. That realization is subtle, but it lingers. For someone who has lived in constant tension, ease can feel radical. You allow yourself one light smile at the irony. Rome, the city of chaos, produces two people whose shared strength is calm. It's almost funny, almost. And if you're waiting for sparks, remember, this isn't that kind of story. This is a slow burn. The kind that heats a room without anyone noticing until they're already comfortable. A second quirky detail slips in as you linger. Roman pregnancy timelines and divorce customs are flexible. Let's say, legal frameworks exist, but enforcement often bends around power. The speed with which Livia's life is about to change shocks modern sensibilities. But in Rome, pragmatism often outruns propriety. You tuck the thought away. It will matter. You step back into the night air and feel the city's pulse steady. Livia moves through Rome with the same awareness you've noticed in Octavian, a sense that survival isn't about dominance, but about adaptation. She has learned to be unreadable when necessary, decisive when possible. She doesn't announce herself as future empress, but you can feel the gravity forming. And as you continue walking, you realize that the union you're moving toward isn't sparked by romance alone. If at all, it's sparked by recognition, by two people seeing, in each other, not escape, but continuity. In a world addicted to upheaval, that's intoxicating. You keep going, because the night hasn't finished arranging itself. The lamplight stretches, the rumors thicken, and somewhere between necessity and choice, a marriage is beginning to take shape, not yet in vows, but in the quiet alignment of two lives that understand exactly what Rome demands. You don't get much time to romanticize this, because Rome never gives anyone time. One moment you're still balancing alliances like plates at a banquet you didn't cater. And the next you're standing in a borrowed house watching Livia adjust her veil. Knowing the city will gossip faster than you can breathe. This marriage is fast enough to make scribes sharpen their pens with suspicious enthusiasm. Livia is visibly pregnant by her former husband. You are freshly powerful and exquisitely watched. And yet here you are, proceeding anyway. Because necessity has decided it doesn't care about your comfort. You tell yourself this union is practical. You repeat it silently, like a calming exercise you learned from a very stern instructor. Practical marriages are respectable in Rome, they sound disciplined, virtuous, almost civic-minded. Love can come later, you think, or not at all. Right now, you need stability, legitimacy, and a household that doesn't wobble under pressure. Livia needs protection, continuity, and a future that isn't dictated by rumor. You both understand the deal. No speeches required. Here's the mainstream historical fact that anchors the moment. You marry Livia in 38 BCE. Mere months after her divorce from Tiberius Claudius Nero, and only 3 days after she gives birth to her son, Drusus. Modern listeners usually inhale sharply at this point. You let them. Rome exhales and moves on. Laws exist, customs exist, but power exists too. And it tends to rearrange the furniture. Historians still argue whether this speed reflects ruthless pragmatism or an urgency born of genuine attachment. You live with the ambiguity, because ambiguity is Rome's favorite accessory. The optics are delicate, you know it. You arrange the explanations with care, legal formalities observed. Witnesses present. Traditions cited. You lean on precedent and ritual language. The Roman equivalent of saying, "This is fine," while flames lick the curtains. Someone mutters that it's indecent. Someone else shrugs and says indecency has never stopped Rome before. You smile politely and keep moving. You learn early that smiling politely is cheaper than hiring more guards. At night, you lie awake rehearsing the narrative. You are restoring order. You are stabilizing households. You are modeling virtue. You repeat these phrases until they sound almost true. Meanwhile, Livia settles into the household with a competence that is immediately useful. She understands servants, schedules, supply chains. She understands how to keep rooms calm. It's not glamorous, but it's foundational. Rome runs on foundations, even when it pretends to worship columns. There's a quirky detail that slides into your awareness as the days pass. Roman weddings themselves can be surprisingly understated when urgency demands it. No weeks of spectacle, no choreographed excess, just the essentials, completed with efficient solemnity. Think less fairy tale, more emergency logistics meeting, except everyone is wearing better fabric. If you're expecting rose petals, you're in the wrong millennium. You feel the city testing the marriage almost immediately. Invitations arrive with subtle recalibrations. Some doors open more easily, others close just enough to notice. People watch Livia closely, not to catch her failing, but to measure her. Rome measures everything. You sense her responding not with defiance, but with steadiness. She doesn't overcorrect. She doesn't apologize. She simply occupies the role, day after day, until it fits like it was always meant to be there. You notice something else too. Your own breathing slows. Not dramatically, just enough to matter. For the first time in years, the household feels predictable. Meals happen on time. Correspondence is managed. Guests are received with consistency. It's a strange relief. The kind you don't realize you needed until it arrives. If this were a modern productivity vlog, this would be the moment you announce your morning routine changed my life. Thankfully, no one asks you to film it. Historians still argue whether Livia's presence immediately moderates your decisions or whether you simply recognize in her a shared preference for order. You feel the difference in texture, not in headlines. Meetings end sooner. Crises feel less theatrical. You don't become kinder overnight, but you become calmer, and in Rome, calm reads as strength. There's gossip, of course. There is always gossip. People speculate about motives, about influence, about what this marriage really means. You hear it in fragments, like background static. You learn not to respond directly. Response feeds the noise. Endurance starves it. You and Livia make a quiet pact, never articulated, but understood, to let time do the arguing for you. A second quirky tidbit surfaces as you settle in. Roman households often revolve around shared rituals that look mundane from the outside, daily offerings, fixed meal times, predictable walks. These rhythms anchor people. You and Livia adopt them quickly. The repetition becomes a language. If love is going to exist here, it will exist inside routine. Not thrilling, perhaps, but deeply effective. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen? No one is wearing it at home. Domestic life is where bad ideas go to die. You feel the weight of expectations press in. This marriage is supposed to mean something. To veterans, to senators, to families who want reassurance that chaos is ending. You become acutely aware that your private choices are being read as public statements. It's exhausting, but you are good at exhaustion by now. Livia is too. That shared stamina matters more than passion ever could. There's a moment, quiet, unrecorded, when you realize the marriage has already survived its first test. Not scandal, not criticism, but normalcy. Days stack on top of each other without incident. Nothing explodes. Nothing collapses. In Rome, that's a victory. You almost laugh at the absurdity of it, then decide not to tempt fate. Rome loves a jinx. Historians still argue whether affection grows quickly or slowly here. You can't give them a neat answer. What you can say is that trust forms early, and trust is heavier than romance. Trust holds weight. Trust keeps rooms from tilting. Trust allows silence without suspicion. You find yourself speaking less and being understood more. That's not nothing. You notice Livia's restraint in public settings, how she never competes for attention, how she allows others to underestimate her. It's a strategy you recognize, because it's one you use yourself. Two people practicing the same discipline tend to collide less. They anticipate each other's movements. They avoid stepping on toes. It's choreography without rehearsal. As weeks turn into months, the marriage settles into the city's background noise. Rome, satisfied for the moment, moves on to fresher scandals. You take the win. You focus on governance, on reforms, on the long work of reshaping a state without calling it that. At home, the household hums, not loudly, reliably. And you realize something that feels almost dangerous to admit. Necessity didn't just force this union. It revealed its suitability. In a world that consumes people who mistake drama for strength, endurance becomes its own kind of intimacy. You don't announce it, you don't celebrate it, you simply keep going, together, while the city adjusts its expectations around you. You wake into routine, and routine, you learn, is where this marriage begins to prove itself. Not in declarations, not in ceremonies, but in the soft clatter of a household finding its rhythm. Morning light filters across mosaic floors. Someone opens a shutter, somewhere a servant clears a throat, politely reminding the day that it has officially started. You dress, not as a conqueror, but as a man who has meetings to survive. Livia is already awake. She's always already awake. That becomes one of those details you never comment on, because commenting would break the spell. Domestic rituals begin to stack up like steady breaths. Breakfast is modest: bread, fruit, watered wine, nothing indulgent. You notice how predictability calms the room. Rome outside remains loud, impatient, theatrical. Inside, the household moves with intention. This is not accidental. Livia understands that power requires insulation. If the public sphere is chaos, the private sphere must be structured enough to absorb it. You benefit from this more than you admit. Here's a mainstream historical fact that settles into your day like a familiar object. Augustus cultivates an image of moral reform, emphasizing family values, modesty, and traditional Roman virtues. These ideas don't just appear in speeches, they are rehearsed at home. The household becomes a demonstration model. People watch. They always watch. The irony is that these moral reforms coexist with compromise and flexibility behind closed doors. Rome thrives on contradiction. You walk the halls and notice small efficiencies. Guests are spaced thoughtfully. Servants are trained to anticipate rather than react. Messages are sorted, prioritized, summarized. None of this makes inscriptions, but all of it makes governance easier. Livia's hand is everywhere and nowhere at once. She does not issue commands publicly. She arranges conditions. If you've ever worked with someone who quietly fixes problems before they become meetings, you know the relief. There's a quirky detail you can't help but notice as the days blur. Roman timekeeping is approximate at best. Hours stretch or shrink with daylight. Schedules are flexible, but habits anchor them. Livia uses this to her advantage. She builds rituals around moments rather than minutes. Meals at certain light levels. Walks when shadows fall a certain way. It's strangely calming. You didn't realize how much you needed structure that didn't shout. You attend dinners together, and here the performance matters. Seating arrangements are subtle messages. Who sits close? Who waits? Who is invited at all? Livia reads the room faster than most senators read laws. She notices who is anxious, who is overconfident, who is quietly dangerous. She rarely comments directly, but later, when you're alone, she'll ask one precise question. You learn to listen to those questions. They're usually better than answers. Historians still argue whether Livia's influence during this period is advisory or strategic. The truth is slippery, because advice shapes strategy when it's consistently heeded. You feel the effect in your own behavior. You pause more, you weigh consequences longer. You don't abandon decisiveness, but you refine it. Power stops feeling like a constant sprint and starts feeling like a controlled pace. Your body thanks you for this. Your enemies notice. The household itself becomes a training ground for restraint. Voices stay low. Disagreements are handled privately. Nothing spills into the street unless it's meant to. This discipline doesn't come naturally to Rome, which prefers spectacle, but spectacle exhausts itself. Quiet competence endures. You begin to see why this partnership works. Neither of you needs to win every room. You only need to keep the structure standing. Another quirky tidbit drifts in while you're not looking. Romans use sponges on sticks instead of toilet paper. Shared in public latrines. Yes, shared. You immediately feel grateful that domestic life allows for alternatives. Some aspects of tradition, you decide, are better left outside. Livia never comments on this, but the household's arrangements suggest mutual agreement. Civilization is selective. You notice how Livia handles your absences. Campaigns, travel, long days that stretch into nights. She doesn't dramatize them, she manages. Correspondence flows. The household doesn't unravel. When you return, things are not waiting for you in piles. They're already resolved. That's not romance. That's trust operationalized. Publicly, your image as a moral restorer grows. Privately, you negotiate compromises that make that image possible. Livia understands the distinction. She never forces you to pretend that ideals are effortless. She understands that ideals require maintenance. Historians still argue whether the moral legislation of this era reflects genuine conviction or political necessity. Living inside it, you realize it's both. Conviction without strategy fails. Strategy without conviction corrodes. You find moments of quiet companionship, walking gardens, shared meals, brief exchanges that don't need elaboration. These moments don't sparkle, they settle. If you're expecting cinematic romance, you might feel cheated, but there's something deeply human about companionship that doesn't demand performance. You are not trying to impress each other. You are trying to function. There are tensions. Of course. No household at this level escapes them. Decisions ripple outward. Family members complicate things. Expectations pile up, but the domestic core holds. You and Livia develop a shared language of glances, pauses, minimal words. You don't argue loudly. You don't reconcile dramatically. You adjust. Historians still argue whether this steadiness masks deeper conflicts or whether it genuinely reflects mutual respect. The evidence is circumstantial, but persistent. The marriage lasts decades, not seasons. In Rome, where alliances collapse faster than bread goes stale, that longevity speaks. As the days accumulate, you realize the marriage is doing something quietly radical. It's making power boring, predictable, administrative. That might sound like an insult, but it's the highest compliment you can offer governance. Rome has had enough excitement. What it needs is endurance. You sit one evening as lamps are lit, listening to the household settle. Outside, the city continues its endless negotiation with itself. Inside, things are calm. You think about how easily this could have gone wrong. How quickly necessity could have turned into resentment. Instead, it has become rhythm. And you understand something that doesn't fit neatly into records: love. Here isn't a feeling you chase. It's a practice you maintain. It shows up in timing, in silence, in the absence of unnecessary drama. It shows up in a household that functions, day after day, while the world tests it. You let that realization sit with you, heavy and warm. Tomorrow will bring more decisions, more performances, more compromises. But tonight, the domestic machinery hums, steady and reliable. In Rome, that's as close to peace as anyone gets. You feel the title change before anyone says it out loud. Rome doesn't announce transformations with trumpets, it lets them seep into walls and habits. One day you're still called Octavian by people who remember when that name meant uncertainty. The next, the city starts to behave as if you are inevitable. You become Augustus not by coronation, but by consensus that quietly gives up resisting. The Republic still exists on paper. Everyone pretends to read it. No one expects it to answer back. This is the mainstream historical fact that settles like a stone in your chest. In 27 BCE, you are granted the title Augustus, marking the beginning of the Roman Principate. You insist on modest phrasing: first citizen, servant of the state, but the power is real, concentrated, and heavy. You feel it in the way rooms adjust when you enter, in the way silences sharpen. Power, you learn, has acoustics. Through all of this, the marriage holds. That's the strange part. As the political stakes climb, domestic life remains consistent. Livia doesn't change her tone. She doesn't rush to claim credit. She doesn't suddenly speak louder because the ceiling is higher. She remains what she has been: attentive, controlled, strategically calm. If anyone expected the new title to inflate her, they are quietly disappointed. You notice how this steadiness becomes a stabilizing force. The Senate debates reforms. Veterans expect rewards. Provinces test boundaries. And through it all, the household doesn't wobble. Meals happen. Rituals continue. Livia ensures continuity, which in a regime trying to look traditional while inventing itself is invaluable. Historians still argue whether this domestic consistency directly supports your political success or merely parallels it. Living inside it, you don't bother separating the two. There's a quirky detail that surfaces as you settle into imperial rhythms. despite all the grandeur. You prefer relatively simple living. Your residence on the Palatine, though impressive, avoids the excess of later emperors. You like clean lines, modest decor, functionality. Some say this is virtue. Others say it's optics. It's probably both. Livia understands the difference and never confuses them. You sense how the marriage shifts in meaning now. It's no longer just a practical alliance, it's a symbol. People read your relationship for clues about the state's future. Are you stable? Are you moderate? Are you restrained? Livia becomes part of that answer without ever being officially asked. Her presence signals continuity, tradition, restraint. Rome relaxes a fraction. That fraction matters. You watch Livia navigate increased visibility with the same discipline she used when no one was watching. She avoids spectacle. She avoids scandal. She avoids overt displays of power. Instead, she focuses on influence through proximity and patience. She is there when decisions are discussed informally, when impressions are formed before votes are cast. She doesn't need a podium. She has access. Historians still argue whether Livia's influence over Augustus is exaggerated by later writers or underestimated by contemporaries who lack the language to describe informal power. You feel the tension of that debate in real time. You know when her counsel shapes your thinking, but you also know when it aligns with instincts you already had. Influence here is not command, it's calibration. The city adjusts to the new order with cautious optimism. You promote peace, stability, restoration. The long wars end, roads are repaired, temples are renewed, people begin to sleep more easily. You understand that peace is not just the absence of war, it's the predictability of tomorrow. At home, predictability is already established. That parallel doesn't escape you. Another quirky tidbit drifts through your awareness. You are deeply superstitious. Attentive to omens, dreams, and signs. You consult priests. You interpret portents. Livia shares this attentiveness, though she filters it through pragmatism. Not every bad dream deserves a policy shift. Not every good omen guarantees success. You balance ritual with reason. Rome appreciates the show of piety, even when it doesn't know the internal negotiations behind it. As Augustus, you feel time stretch. Decisions echo longer. Mistakes linger. The marriage adapts. Livia becomes not just a partner, but a constant reference point. Someone who remembers what it was like before the title settled. Someone who doesn't treat power as novelty. That memory anchors you. Without it, you suspect the role could swallow the person. You attend ceremonies together, and you notice how the crowd watches Livia almost as closely as it watches you. Not for missteps, but for signals. She offers none. Her composure becomes its own message, continuity, restraint, endurance. In a city addicted to drama, this feels almost rebellious. Historians still argue whether Augustus' long reign owes more to his political genius or to the stabilizing influence of his personal relationships. It's a false choice. You feel how the personal and political braid together. Leadership without support phrase. Support without purpose drifts. The marriage provides ballast. There are moments of strain. Increased scrutiny means increased pressure. Every gesture is interpreted. Every silence analyzed. You and Livia adjust by becoming even more private. Disagreements stay contained. Decisions are processed before they become visible. You learn that transparency has limits, and privacy can be protective. You also notice aging creeping in, not as decline, but as awareness. The future stretches longer now, and succession becomes a question you can't postpone. The marriage, steady as it is, does not produce children together. That absence becomes a quiet presence. You don't speak of it often, but it shapes conversations, plans, anxieties. Rome, meanwhile, begins to accept the new normal. Augustus is not temporary. The household on the Palatine is not provisional. The marriage is not a placeholder. It's a fixture. People stop waiting for collapse and start planning with instability. That shift is subtle, but transformative. As night falls, you sit with Livia in lamplight. Not discussing policy, not rehearsing speeches, just sharing the quiet that comes after a day of holding the world in place. You think about how power often isolates, but partnership, real partnership, can counterbalance that isolation. The title has changed, the stakes have risen, the city has adjusted its breathing, and through it all, the marriage remains what it has been since the beginning, not dramatic, not loud, but durable. In Rome, durability is the closest thing to love that history reliably records. You start to notice it in the margins of decisions. The places where power doesn't announce itself. Livia's influence doesn't arrive with declarations or raised voices, it arrives as timing. A suggestion made when you're already leaning that way. A concern voiced after everyone else has left the room. A pause that invites you to reconsider without telling you to stop. If power were music, hers would be the bass line, felt more than heard, holding everything together. This is the mainstream historical fact that anchors the texture of these years. Livia becomes one of the most influential women in Roman history without holding any official office. She is granted honors, visibility, and access unusual for a woman of her time. Yet her authority remains informal. You live inside that informality. You understand its strength. Commands provoke resistance, counsel invites ownership. When you act after hearing her, the decision still feels like yours. That's not manipulation. That's partnership tuned to reality. You picture the private spaces where this influence lives. Gardens at dusk, walks along shaded paths, evenings where the day's tensions loosen just enough for honesty. Livia listens first. She asks questions that sound simple but aren't. Who benefits from this? Who feels ignored? What happens if you wait? You don't always take her advice. That matters too. Influence that insists stops being influence and becomes pressure. Livia knows when to retreat. Historians still argue whether she actively shapes policy or merely reinforces Augustus' instincts. It's a tempting debate because it invites neat categories. Living it, you find categories unhelpful. Sometimes her perspective redirects you. Sometimes it steadies you when impatience flares. Sometimes it simply reminds you what the room feels like to people who aren't speaking. Power dulls that sensitivity quickly. She keeps yours sharp. There's a quirky tidbit that slips into the picture. Livia becomes known for her austere personal style, simple dress, restrained presentation, so much so that it sets a fashion standard. This isn't accidental. In a society watching closely for excess, restraint reads as virtue. You benefit from it politically. She never says that out loud, but you both understand the language of appearances. Rome speaks it fluently. You see her influence most clearly in moments of restraint. A proposal comes forward, popular but destabilizing. The room leans toward action. Livia doesn't oppose it directly. She asks one question about timing, another about precedent. The energy shifts. The decision slows. Sometimes slowing is the entire point. Rome is good at action. It's terrible at patience. You become better at patience with her nearby. You also notice how she manages relationships beyond you. Senators' wives, family networks, patronage lines. These aren't footnotes, they are infrastructure. Livia maintains them with a consistency that prevents small resentments from becoming public fractures. She remembers birthdays. She arranges meetings that feel casual but aren't. She understands that stability is built in advance, not in crisis. Historians still argue whether later writers exaggerate Livia's role because they need a villain or a mastermind to explain Rome's smooth transition into empire. You feel the unfairness of that framing. It misses the quieter truth. Most systems don't survive on brilliance alone. They survive on maintenance. Livia excels at maintenance. That excellence looks invisible until it's gone. You share meals where nothing remarkable happens. And that, you realize, is remarkable. No shouting, no surprises, no emotional ambushes, just conversation that flows and ends. You think about how rare this is in Rome, where dinners can become political battlegrounds. The absence of drama becomes its own luxury. There's another quirky detail that amuses you when you catch it. Livia is known to be meticulous about household order. Even to the point of reusing clothing and repairing items rather than replacing them. In an empire of conquest, thrift sends a signal. You don't comment on it publicly, but you notice how people adjust their own behavior around it. Frugality becomes fashionable. Rome imitates what it sees near power. You feel the cumulative effect of this quiet influence on your own temperament. You interrupt less. You listen longer. You tolerate ambiguity without rushing to resolve it. That's not weakness, it's efficiency. Decisions made too quickly often demand correction. Corrections are expensive. Livia saves you expense, political, emotional, temporal. Historians still argue whether Augustus would have ruled as long or as steadily without this partnership. Counterfactuals are easy to argue and impossible to prove. You don't bother with them. You live in outcomes. And the outcome here is a regime that feels less brittle than Rome's recent past. People adjust. They invest. They plan futures instead of exits. You notice, too, How Livia handles disagreement with you. She doesn't perform it. She doesn't recruit allies. She waits for the right moment. Then speaks plainly. No theatrics. No humiliation. That restraint preserves trust. You never feel cornered. You feel consulted. In a world where many relationships are transactional, this feels almost radical. As evening settles, you find yourselves sharing quiet again. Not discussing policy. Not rehearsing narratives. Just being present in the same space. Lamps flicker. The city murmurs beyond the walls. You think about how easily power could isolate you. How quickly it could turn every interaction into strategy. This partnership resists that drift. It keeps something human intact. Rome continues to test you. New challenges surface. Old enemies resurface in softer disguises. Through it all, the influence remains what it has always been, understated, persistent, effective. You don't need to name it to rely on it. You realize that endurance isn't just about surviving storms. It's about maintaining shape when there is no storm, about not collapsing inward from the quiet. Livia helps you do that. She keeps the structure balanced, not by propping it up, but by distributing weight evenly. And as you sit there, the thought settles without drama. The quiet influence you share isn't ancillary to power. It's central. Rome may remember laws and monuments. You remember evenings, questions, pauses. You remember how stability feels when it's practiced daily, not announced. You let the night hold that thought for you. Tomorrow will bring more rooms, more voices, more expectations. Tonight, the influence hums softly, doing its work without applause. And that, you suspect, is exactly how it prefers it. You feel it tightening long before anyone says the word succession. It creeps into conversations the way cold creeps into stone, slow, unavoidable, impossible to ignore once you notice it. Dinners linger a little longer. Questions circle instead of landing. People mention children in ways that sound casual but aren't. You and Livia don't rush this topic, but it's there, sitting quietly between you like an uninvited guest who refuses to leave. This is the mainstream historical fact that anchors the unease. Augustus has no surviving biological sons. The future of the regime depends on heirs drawn from extended family, stepchildren, adopted sons, carefully selected successors. Rome has seen what happens when succession is unclear, and it still smells faintly of smoke and blood from those memories. You carry that history in your bones. Livia does too. You think about children not as symbols, but as people whose lives will be shaped by choices made before they understand them. Tiberius and Drusus, Livia's sons from her previous marriage, move through the household with different energies. Drusus is open, charismatic, naturally liked. Tiberius is more reserved, thoughtful, slightly distant, someone who carries his inner weather privately. You watch them both, not as a doting father exactly, but as a man weighing futures. Historians still argue whether Livia actively promotes her son's advancement or whether Augustus independently recognizes their suitability. You feel the debate in the air whenever their names surface. You know Livia is careful. She doesn't push, she waits. She lets events unfold just enough for patterns to emerge. Patience, again, doing its quiet work. There's a quirky detail that surfaces as you observe family life. Roman elite children are raised with a surprising mix of affection and discipline. Tutors, moral instruction, physical training, it's all deliberate. Play exists, but it's structured. You see how this environment shapes personalities. Drusus thrives in it. Tiberius endures it. You file that away. Endurance, you've learned, can matter more than charm. The household carries a strange duality now. On the surface, things remain calm, orderly, predictable. Beneath that, anxiety hums. Not panic. Rome has had enough of that, but anticipation. Who will inherit responsibility without tearing the fabric you've spent years weaving? You feel the pressure because you know the system isn't self-sustaining yet. It needs continuity, not brilliance. You and Livia talk in fragments. Not arguments. Not plans carved in stone, fragments. Observations. Hypotheticals. If something happened, in the long term, these conversations don't end cleanly. They pause. They resume weeks later as if no time has passed. This is how decisions form here. Slowly. Layered. Resistant to spectacle. Historians still argue whether Augustus ever feels genuine warmth toward Tiberius or merely strategic acceptance. Living it, you'd say warmth isn't always loud. Sometimes it looks like trust. You give Tiberius responsibilities gradually. You watch how he handles them. He doesn't seek applause. He completes tasks. He absorbs criticism without drama. You recognize the temperament. It looks uncomfortably familiar. Another quirky tidbit drifts through your thoughts. Roman adoption is not primarily about family sentiment. It's about continuity. Names, roles, responsibilities transfer through legal ritual as much as blood. This flexibility allows you options. But it also makes everything feel provisional. Relationships shift with paperwork. Affection has to survive legal frameworks. You wonder, briefly, how anyone manages to feel secure. Then you remember, they manage by pretending security exists. You notice Livia's restraint during this period. She doesn't publicly celebrate her son's successes. She doesn't correct critics aggressively. She allows uncertainty to exist without filling it with noise. That restraint frustrates some observers, who mistake quiet for passivity. You know better. Quiet here is strategic. It keeps doors open. Historians still argue whether the series of deaths and misfortunes that affect potential heirs are coincidence, fate, or something darker. You refuse to entertain those narratives. Rome loves a villain. It loves simple explanations for complex outcomes. Living through loss teaches you how random and cruel stability's enemies can be. You don't assign blame where there is only grief. The household absorbs these losses with practiced solemnity. Mourning is ritualized. Emotions are contained. You feel the weight of it in empty spaces at dinner, in names no longer spoken casually. Livia bears this with composure that some mistake for coldness. You recognize it as endurance under strain. You grow more aware of time. Not just its passing, but its narrowing. Decisions that once felt theoretical now feel urgent. You sense the marriage adjusting again, not dramatically, but decisively. Conversations sharpen. Silences lengthen. You and Livia become even more aligned in your caution. Neither of you wants to leave chaos behind. As night settles, you sit with the awareness that legacy is not abstract. It lives in people, in habits, in systems that only work if someone chooses to keep them working. Love, here, is braided tightly with responsibility. You don't get to separate them. You look at Livia across lamplight. No words are exchanged. None are needed. You both understand that endurance is being tested in a new way, not by scandal, not by politics, but by time itself. And time, unlike Rome, does not negotiate. You let the night hold that thought. Tomorrow will bring more deliberations, more cautious steps forward. Tonight, the household rests, carrying both stability and uncertainty in equal measure. And you accept that this, too, is part of the marriage, shared vigilance over a future that refuses to announce itself. You start to notice the contradiction settling into your days like a familiar ache. Publicly, you are the architect of virtue. Privately, you are a man negotiating reality. Rome watches you preach restraint, fidelity, and moral renewal, and it applauds, because applause is easier than compliance. Meanwhile, inside your household, you and Livia manage the distance between ideal and practice with careful hands. This isn't hypocrisy, it's governance. Ideals are aspirational, lives are complicated. Here's the mainstream historical fact that frames this tension. Augustus enacts sweeping moral legislation, including laws promoting marriage, discouraging adultery, and incentivizing childbirth among the Roman elite. These laws are serious, punitive, and deeply intrusive. They reach into bedrooms and dinner conversations alike. Rome nods along, publicly supportive, privately irritated. You feel the strain immediately. The closer law moves to daily life, the louder the grumbling becomes. You sense Livia's awareness of this before anyone speaks openly. She understands optics. She understands backlash. She understands that moral reform works best when it appears inevitable rather than enforced. She advises caution, not against the laws themselves, but against how loudly they are wielded. Historians still argue whether these reforms reflect Augustus' genuine desire to restore traditional values or a strategic effort to control elite behavior. Living inside them, you recognize both impulses. You want stability. You also want compliance. Rome has taught you that persuasion and pressure are twins. There's a quirky tidbit that slips into this period. Romans develop elaborate ways to signal compliance without full commitment. Marriages arranged but not consummated. Children acknowledged late. Legal loopholes exploited creatively. If this were a modern bureaucracy, it would be called workarounds. You watch the elite adapt, sometimes with impressive creativity. Livia notices too. And she never mocks it. She understands survival instincts when she sees them. Your household becomes a reference point. People watch how you live, not just what you say. Livia's visible restraint helps. Her reputation for modesty and discipline lends credibility to reforms that might otherwise feel imposed. She doesn't sermonize, she embodies. That distinction matters. Rome tolerates example better than instruction. Historians still argue whether Livia privately supports these laws enthusiastically or merely understands their political necessity. You don't categorize her stance so neatly. She supports stability. She supports predictability. She supports anything that reduces the likelihood of Rome tearing itself apart again. If moral legislation helps, she'll help it. If it backfires, she'll help you adjust. You feel the irony sharpen when family becomes the testing ground. The laws apply to everyone, including your own. When scandal touches close to home, the contradiction becomes unavoidable. Public principle collides with private affection. You discover how unforgiving law can be when it stops being theoretical. The city watches closely, hungry for consistency. You experience this tension not as a moral drama, but as an administrative problem with emotional consequences. Decisions must be made, precedents set. You feel the weight of each choice because it echoes beyond the household. Livia stands with you in these moments, not softening reality, not dramatizing it either. She understands that mercy and order sometimes pull in opposite directions. A second quirky detail surfaces as you navigate this terrain. Roman gossip moves faster than official announcements. Rumors fill gaps before facts arrive. You learn to anticipate them, to respond indirectly, to let time correct exaggeration. Livia is particularly adept at this. She knows when silence is safer than denial. She knows when acknowledgement fuels the fire. Historians still argue whether Augustus' strict moral stance ultimately strengthens Roman society or breeds resentment and hypocrisy. From inside, you see both outcomes unfolding simultaneously. Some families stabilize, others rebel quietly. No reform lands cleanly. Livia helps you absorb that reality without abandoning the effort. She doesn't demand purity, she demands persistence. You find yourselves discussing not love, but limits. How far can law reach before it fractures trust? How much example is enough? These are not romantic conversations, but they are intimate. They require honesty. They require shared responsibility. Love, here, looks like mutual endurance through uncomfortable choices. As nights pass, you feel the household adapt again. Conversations become more guarded, decisions more deliberate. The marriage, already tested by speed and scrutiny, now absorbs moral pressure. It holds, not because it's flawless, but because it's aligned. You and Livia agree on priorities, even when outcomes hurt. You sit one evening as lamps flicker, aware that Rome's appetite for judgment never sleeps. You think about how easy it would be to retreat into private comfort and let public life harden. You don't. Livia doesn't let you. She understands that disengagement is its own kind of failure. Historians still argue whether this era represents Rome's moral peak or the beginning of performative virtue. You let them argue, living it. You know that governance is rarely pure and never simple. It is compromise refined by repetition. As the city quiets, you feel the tension ease just enough to rest. The marriage remains steady, absorbing contradictions without collapsing. Public ideals stand, private compromises persist, and between them, you continue walking the narrow path that keeps Rome from sliding back into chaos. You breathe slower. Tomorrow will bring more scrutiny, more adjustments. Tonight, the household holds, steady and alert. Love here is not escape from contradiction. It is the shared work of carrying it. You feel the temperature drop before the word exile is spoken. It's subtle, conversations shorten. Glances linger a second too long. Laughter loses its ease. Rome doesn't like surprises that implicate the powerful, but it loves watching them squirm. Scandal, when it arrives, doesn't knock, it seeps, and when it touches your family, it doesn't feel like drama. It feels like a structural test. Here's the mainstream historical fact that lands with a dull thud. Julia, your daughter, becomes the center of a public scandal involving adultery. And you enforce the law you created by banishing her from Rome. You don't do this lightly. You don't do it theatrically. You do it because the law is watching you as closely as the crowd is. You feel the contradiction bite hard. Private grief versus public principle, and you choose consistency. Knowing the cost. Historians still argue whether this decision reflects uncompromising integrity or calculated example-making. From inside the moment, it feels like neither. It feels like being crushed between obligations that refuse to bend. You don't announce your anguish. You formalize it. Rome respects form. It doesn't ask how you sleep afterward. Livia stands beside you, not visibly directing, not publicly consoling. Her support arrives as steadiness. She manages the household's response, the logistics, the communications. She absorbs the shock without amplifying it. Some expect her to exploit the situation. She doesn't. That restraint matters. In a city eager to assign motives, refusing to perform one becomes a statement. A quirky detail drifts in. Unwelcome but real. Exile in Rome is not imprisonment. It's isolation with paperwork. Julia's punishment involves distance, restriction, and surveillance, not chains. That doesn't make it gentle. It makes it prolonged. You understand that endurance can be harsher than spectacle. You choose it anyway. You feel the city testing you again. Whispers ask whether the moral laws are real or just decoration. Your response is action. You let the precedent stand. People take note. Some admire it. Some resent it. Everyone adjusts. That's how norms settle, through discomfort. Historians still argue whether Livia influenced this outcome directly or merely supported its execution. You resist that framing. The decision is yours. The support is hers. That division matters. Partnership doesn't erase responsibility, it distributes survival. Livia helps the household remain functional when grief threatens to paralyze it. The household changes after this. Conversations soften. Laughter becomes rarer, more deliberate. You notice empty spaces at dinner. Names avoided. Memories handled carefully. Livia manages these absences with dignity. She doesn't rush healing. She allows time to do its quiet, uneven work. Another quirky tidbit surfaces as you navigate the aftermath. Roman letters are often read aloud to groups. Not privately. News travels communally. Privacy is negotiated, not assumed. Livia controls what is read, when, and to whom. That control protects the household from becoming a theater of pity or outrage. Silence, again, becomes a tool. You feel your age more acutely now. Not in bones, but in patience. Scandal drains energy faster than war. You rely more on routine, more on familiar rhythms. Livia reinforces them without comment. She understands that stability is fragile when emotion spikes. She shores it up quietly. Historians still argue whether this episode hardens Augustus or deepens his commitment to order. You experience both. Compassion doesn't disappear, it retreats inward. Publicly, you become more controlled. Privately, you grieve without audience. Love, here, is not consolation, it's presence without demands. You notice how the city moves on. It always does. New scandals surface. Old ones fade. The law remains. Your reputation adjusts. The household steadies. This is Rome's rhythm. Outrage. Adaptation. Forgetfulness. You don't take comfort in it, but you accept it. As nights pass, you sit with Livia in shared quiet. No speeches. No reassurances. Just the knowledge that partnership means staying when staying is hardest. You think about endurance again. How it's tested not by success, but by loss. The marriage absorbs this shock the way it has absorbed others, without collapse. Without spectacle. That doesn't mean it's untouched. It means it's resilient. You let the night hold that truth for you. Tomorrow will bring more governance, more judgment, more performance. Tonight, the household breathes carefully, holding grief and duty in the same space. And you remain, together, doing the unglamorous work of holding things together when they would rather fall apart. You become more attentive to signs as the years stack up, omens, dreams, small coincidences that feel heavier than they should. Rome has always been superstitious, but age sharpens your sensitivity. When you've seen how quickly order can unravel, you start listening for warnings in unlikely places. A bird's flight, a dream that lingers too long after waking, a feeling that settles in your chest without explanation. You don't dismiss these things. You catalogue them. This is the mainstream historical fact that frames this phase of your life. Augustus places enormous emphasis on religion, ritual, and public piety, restoring temples, reviving priesthoods, and tying divine favor tightly to political stability. Faith is not just belief, it's infrastructure. Rome needs to feel watched over. You give it that reassurance, carefully choreographed and consistently reinforced. Livia shares this attentiveness, though she approaches it with measured calm. She listens to augurs, she respects omens, but she doesn't surrender judgment to them. You notice how she filters signs through practicality. Not every thunderclap requires a decree. Not every bad dream demands a sacrifice. Historians still argue whether Livia's religious posture is genuine devotion or political performance. You suspect it's both. In Rome, sincerity and strategy often occupy the same space without conflict. There's a quirky detail that sticks with you. You are known to keep protective charms close, including seals and small talismans meant to ward off misfortune. You don't advertise this. You don't deny it either. Power doesn't eliminate fear, it refines it. Livia understands that. She never mocks your caution. She shares it quietly. You walk through restored temples, inhaling incense and old stone. Priests chant familiar rhythms. Crowds respond predictably. Ritual has a calming effect on masses and leaders alike. You feel it in your own breathing. The repetition steadies you. It also legitimizes the new order. If the gods approve, people relax, or at least they pretend to. Historians still argue whether Augustus truly believes the gods favor his rule or whether he believes belief itself is the stabilizing force. You don't separate those questions anymore. Belief works because people act on it. That's enough. At home, rituals take on a smaller scale. Daily offerings, fixed times, quiet observances. Livia oversees these with consistency. She understands that domestic ritual anchors public ceremony. If the household wavers, the image fractures. She keeps the rhythm intact, even when grief or fatigue presses in. Another quirky tidbit surfaces as you age. Romans interpret dreams seriously, especially recurring ones. You begin to notice patterns in yours, repeated images, familiar anxieties. You share some of these with Livia. She listens without alarm. She asks what you think they mean. That question matters more than the interpretation itself. It keeps agency with you. You feel superstition and reason weaving together in your decisions. You consult experts. You weigh advice. You don't abdicate responsibility. Livia supports this balance. She doesn't push you toward mysticism or skepticism. She understands that extremes destabilize. Moderation holds. Historians still argue whether Augustus' religious reforms are sincere attempts at moral renewal or calculated tools of control. Living through them, you experience them as maintenance. Systems require care. Belief is one of the systems Rome relies on most. As the city settles into routine peace, you notice fewer omens demanded by crisis and more by habit. That, too, feels like success. When people have time to worry about signs, it means they're not worrying about survival. Livia notices this shift as well. She treats it as progress. You sit together in lamplight, discussing nothing urgent. The conversation drifts. You share observations rather than plans. The night feels less charged. You realize that faith, like love, has become quieter, less about rescue, more about continuity. You think again of endurance, of how it requires attention to small things, rituals, habits, signs that others might ignore. Livia excels at that attention. She keeps the household, and by extension, the image of rule, aligned with something older and steadier than any one decision. As sleep edges closer, you let the symbols fade into background hum. Tomorrow will bring more duties, more interpretations, more careful listening. Tonight, the rituals have done their work. The gods are acknowledged. The household is calm. You rest with the understanding that belief here is not escape from uncertainty. It is a way of living alongside it without panic. And in that shared approach, measured, attentive, grounded, you and Livia continue to practice the quiet endurance that has carried you this far. You begin to sense the argument forming before anyone voices it. Because history loves to argue after the fact. Even while you're alive, interpretations stack up around you like scaffolding, some helpful, some intrusive, all unavoidable. Who truly steers the reforms? Who tempers whom? Is power here shared, borrowed, or simply mirrored? You hear versions of these questions in passing remarks, in careful compliments, in the way visitors address Livia just a beat differently than they used to. This is the mainstream historical fact anchoring the debate. Livia receives unprecedented honors for a Roman woman, public recognition, statues, privileges that blur traditional boundaries. She is visible in ways earlier generations would have found unsettling. Yet the formal structures remain unchanged. No office, no decree, just proximity. You live inside that contradiction daily. Rome is learning how to name something it hasn't seen before. You notice how often credit becomes contested terrain. A reform passes smoothly, and observers speculate. Was this Augustus' vision? Livia's counsel? A Senate compromise? You don't correct them. You've learned that clarity invites resistance, while ambiguity allows acceptance. Historians still argue whether this ambiguity is intentional strategy or simply the byproduct of shared governance without language to describe it. You suspect it's both. Naming power can limit it. There's a quirky tidbit that amuses you as you listen to these murmurs. Roman writers love moralizing narratives. They prefer heroes and villains to systems. When they can't find one, they invent one. Livia becomes a convenient focal point, either the ideal matron or the manipulative force behind the throne. Depending on the author's appetite for drama, you recognize the pattern. You've watched reputations bend under simpler pressures. You see how Livia handles this attention. She doesn't protest. She doesn't perform innocence. She continues as before, trusting that consistency will outlast rumor. It's a risk, but one she understands. Influence that defends itself loudly often weakens. Influence that persists quietly hardens into normalcy. Historians still argue whether Augustus consciously cultivates this shared image to diffuse responsibility or whether it emerges organically from partnership. Living it, you feel how decisions are made in layers, some yours, some informed by counsel, some shaped by context neither of you controls. The idea of a single hand on the wheel feels naive. Rome is too large for that. You notice how the marriage adapts again, not to crisis, but to commentary. The household becomes even more discreet. Conversations narrow to essentials. You and Livia develop an almost instinctive sense of when to speak publicly and when to remain silent. This restraint frustrates critics, which secretly pleases you. If they're frustrated, it means they don't have leverage. Another quirky detail drifts in as you reflect. Roman statues often idealize beyond recognition. Wrinkles smoothed, expressions softened. You've seen your own likeness transformed into something calmer, younger, more divine. Livia's image undergoes similar treatment. You both become symbols that barely resemble the people walking the halls at night. It's unsettling, but useful. Symbols absorb blame that people can't. You think about how shared credit also means shared suspicion. If success is collective, so is blame. Livia accepts that without complaint. She understands that visibility carries cost. You respect that endurance. It mirrors your own willingness to carry contradictions without resolving them. Historians still argue whether this period represents Rome's most balanced governance or simply a lull before future instability. You don't pretend to see the future clearly. You focus on maintaining equilibrium now. That's enough work for one lifetime. You sit together one evening. The city quieter than it used to be. Peace has dulled Rome's edge. People complain about smaller things now. You consider that a success. Livia listens as you speak, occasionally interjecting with a question that reframes rather than challenges. You value that skill more than flattery. You realize that love, here, isn't about merging identities. It's about coordinating them. Two perspectives, aligned enough to move together, distinct enough to catch what the other misses. That coordination becomes your shared strength. It doesn't eliminate debate, it refines it. As the night deepens, you let the arguments swirl without engaging them. Let future scholars sharpen their theories. Let biographers argue motives. Living inside the partnership, you know the truth is quieter and less theatrical. Stability is built by people willing to share space without needing to dominate it. You breathe slower. The city rests. The household hums softly. Credit and blame can wait until morning, or until centuries later. For now, the work continues, steady and unannounced, exactly the way it has always worked best. You notice your body before you notice the ears. A stiffness that takes longer to loosen. A fatigue that doesn't vanish with sleep. Power doesn't slow time, it just distracts you from noticing it. Rome still looks to you as if permanence were possible. But your joints disagree. Livia notices first, of course. She always does. Not with alarm, not with fuss, just with small adjustments that make the days smoother. A later meeting here, a shorter walk there, aging, you learn, announces itself in accommodations. This is the mainstream historical fact grounding this stage of life. Augustus rules for decades. Far longer than most Roman leaders. And reaches old age still in power. Longevity becomes part of the regime's identity. People grow up knowing only your rule. That familiarity is comforting to them, and exhausting to you. You carry continuity like a weight that must not slip. The marriage adapts again. It always does. Livia shifts from partner in motion to partner in pacing. She watches your energy the way a navigator watches wind. She doesn't stop you from working, she helps you work sustainably. That may sound unromantic, but it's intimacy of a particular depth. Caring not about how brilliant a moment looks, but whether you can still stand tomorrow. Historians still argue whether Augustus' later years reflect wisdom mellowed by experience or rigidity hardened by success. Living inside them, you feel both impulses tugging. You trust your judgment more, but you also recognize its limits. That recognition doesn't come naturally. Livia helps by asking questions that slow you just enough to reconsider without undermining confidence. There's a quirky detail that surfaces as age settles in. You are known to nap during the day. Unapologetically, short rests, practical pauses. Rome might gossip, but your body doesn't care. You've learned that endurance requires maintenance. Livia builds these pauses into the household rhythm, treating rest as strategy rather than indulgence. If this were modern advice, it would sound suspiciously like wellness culture. In Rome, it's just survival. You spend more time in gardens now, not for display, but for ease. The sound of water, the shade of trees, the repetition of paths that don't demand attention. You walk together, sometimes speaking, sometimes not. Silence no longer feels like something to fill. It feels earned. You remember earlier years when silence felt dangerous, when gaps invited suspicion. Now, silence signals trust. Historians still argue whether Livia's influence increases as Augustus ages or whether it simply becomes more visible as he delegates. You feel the shift not as loss of control, but as redistribution. Some decisions no longer require your direct attention. Others demand it more urgently. Livia helps triage without making you feel diminished. That balance matters. You notice the city aging with you. Buildings weather, roads wear smooth, generations replace one another. People tell stories about the old days that include your early reign. Already mythologized, it's unsettling to hear your life described as an era. Livia grounds you in the present. In practical details, what needs repair? Who needs reassurance? Which habits still work? Another quirky tidbit drifts in as you reflect. Augustus is famously careful about his public image even in old age. Managing appearances, health rumors, and visibility. You don't disappear, you curate presence. Livia understands the necessity of this and helps manage it, ensuring continuity without pretending invincibility. Rome doesn't need you immortal, it needs you consistent. You talk more about legacy now, but without urgency. You've already learned that urgency clouds judgment. Conversations circle succession, memory, what should endure and what can fade. Livia listens, occasionally redirecting focus from monuments to systems. Statues crumble, systems persist. You appreciate that clarity. Historians still argue whether Augustus' greatest achievement is peace, administration, or image. You'd add endurance, the ability to hold a shape over time without cracking. That's what you and Livia have practiced together. Not perfection, persistence. Evenings stretch longer, lamps are lit earlier. You find comfort in repetition. Meals that taste familiar, rooms that hold heat. The marriage has moved beyond proving itself. It simply exists, steady and accommodating, like architecture that no one notices until it's gone. You think about how easily this could have ended differently. How many Roman unions fracture under pressure? Ambition, boredom. Yours has adapted instead. That adaptation hasn't been loud. It hasn't been celebrated. It's been practiced daily, like walking the same path until it becomes smooth. As night settles, you rest more fully now, not because worries have vanished, but because they're shared. Livia sits nearby, reading or listening, present without demand. You feel the rare relief of not having to perform. Tomorrow will bring its own negotiations. Today ends gently. You close your eyes with the sense that aging here is not decline, but transition into a slower, steadier version of endurance that has always defined this partnership. You sense the ending before it arrives. The way you sense a season changing, not with drama, but with a gradual softening. The air feels different. Decisions take longer, not because you hesitate, but because you're measuring how much they will matter after you're gone. Rome has learned to function with you at its center. Now it has to imagine itself without you. And that imagination makes people nervous. You feel their anxiety the way you feel weather pressure before rain. This is the mainstream historical fact that steadies the moment, Augustus dies in 14 CE after a long reign. And the transition of power, remarkably, holds. There is no immediate collapse. No scramble of rivals tearing at the edges. The system works. That may be your greatest quiet triumph. You don't announce it. You feel it in the absence of chaos. As your strength fades, Livia becomes more present, not louder, not more forceful, just closer. She manages access, filters noise, protects your remaining energy. This isn't control, it's care. You let her do it because you trust her judgment, and because you are tired in a way that power cannot fix. Historians still argue whether Livia's role in these final days is administrative necessity or political positioning. Living it, you don't separate the two. Endings require order as much as beginnings. There's a quirky detail that surfaces in this quiet. Roman deathbeds are rarely private. Advisors, family, attendants hover, each with their own reason for being there. You navigate this with practiced composure. Even now, you choose words carefully, you arrange appearances, you understand that your last impressions will echo. Livia helps you manage that echo, ensuring calm where panic would otherwise bloom. You think about memory, not how you want to be praised, but how you want Rome to feel after you're gone. Safe, oriented, capable of continuing. You give final instructions that sound modest but carry weight. Trust the system, respect the succession, maintain the peace. These aren't poetic lines, they're practical. You've always preferred practical. Historians still argue whether Augustus' final moments are serene or calculated, whether his famous composure is genuine or staged. You experience it as relief. Relief that the holding is nearly done. Relief that the structure stands without constant reinforcement. Livia senses this shift and adjusts again. Less instruction, more presence. She sits nearby, not filling silence, letting it do its work. You notice how Rome responds even before the news spreads. The city feels suspended, as if holding its breath. Lamps burn a little longer. Voices lower. People wait. When the moment comes, it arrives without spectacle. A life that reshaped the world ends quietly. In a room that smells of oil lamps and old wood. Livia remains composed. She has practiced composure for decades. Grief does not overwhelm her, it settles. She moves immediately into continuity, ensuring rites are observed, messages delivered, transitions respected. Some mistake this for coldness. You know better. You've lived alongside this strength long enough to recognize it as endurance in its final form. Another quirky detail lingers in the aftermath. Augustus is deified. Formally declared a god by the Senate. Apotheosis turns a man into symbol. You find the irony almost amusing. After a lifetime of insisting on modest titles, you become divine by committee. Livia navigates this transformation with care, honoring the ritual without indulging excess. She understands the power of symbol, and its limits. Historians still argue whether this deification reflects genuine reverence or political convenience. From where you stand, half memory, half echo, it doesn't matter. What matters is that Rome believes in continuity. Belief stabilizes. You've learned that lesson well. As memory overtakes presence, you sense Livia continuing the work you shared. She does not collapse into the past. She carries it forward, translating partnership into stewardship. The marriage doesn't end with death, it changes form. Its influence persists in habits, systems, expectations. The city mourns, then it adjusts. That's Rome's way. You find comfort in that adjustment. It means the structure held. The endurance mattered. Your awareness fades not into darkness, but into quiet, the kind of quiet you've cultivated for years. Lamps dim, footsteps recede. Livia remains, steady as ever, bridging the space between what was and what will be. And somewhere in that softening, you release the weight, the holding passes on, Rome continues. The marriage, recast as memory and influence, remains woven into the fabric you helped shape. You realize, in the quiet that follows, that endurance is a strange legacy. It doesn't announce itself with triumph. It doesn't glitter. It reveals itself only when things don't fall apart. Rome continues to wake up. Shops open. Officials argue. People complain about taxes and weather and bread quality. Exactly as they always have. That ordinariness feels like a compliment. It means the world didn't crack when you let go. This is the mainstream historical fact that closes the circle. The transition from Augustus to Tiberius occurs without immediate civil war. A rarity in Roman history. The system you shaped, carefully, cautiously, holds. It isn't perfect. It isn't gentle. but it functions. Historians still argue whether this stability is the result of Augustus' genius, institutional reform, or sheer exhaustion after decades of conflict. Living it, you'd say it's endurance made visible. You think back, not in a montage way, not with swelling music, but in fragments. Lamplit streets, quiet gardens, long dinners where nothing dramatic happened. A woman who didn't demand the spotlight, but never left the room. Livia's presence threads through these memories not as a highlight, but as a constant. She was there when necessity forced speed. She was there when routine demanded patience. She was there when grief narrowed the world. And she was there when silence became more valuable than words. Historians still argue whether this marriage should be called love in any modern sense. You find the question oddly misplaced. Love, as you lived it, was not about escape or intensity. It was about shared attention, shared restraint, shared responsibility for keeping things upright when gravity pulled hard. If romance is fire, this was stone, warm when held long enough, steady even when weathered. There's a quirky detail you remember with faint amusement, after all the omens, rituals, and divine symbolism. What endures most clearly are habits. The way days were structured, the way conversations were paced, the way decisions were allowed to cool before being announced. Empires don't survive on passion. They survive on habits practiced long enough to feel natural. You imagine Livia now, continuing in her role, not as ruler, not as shadow monarch, but as anchor. She lives on, respected, consulted, still measured. People still project stories onto her. Villain, matron, architect, survivor. Historians still argue which mask fits best. You know none of them fit completely. Real people rarely do. You feel no urge to correct the record. Records belong to the living. What you leave behind isn't a defense, but a pattern. Stability after chaos, routine after upheaval, continuity after fear. The marriage was never a spectacle. It was a structure, and structures don't demand applause, they demand maintenance. As the thought settles, the world softens around it. You're no longer holding anything in place. The work has passed on. Others will misunderstand it, reshape it, criticize it. That's fine. Endurance doesn't require gratitude, it requires time. And now, time stretches differently. Your breathing slows. The city fades into suggestion rather than sound. Marble cools. Lamplight dims. You no longer need to watch for signs or omens. You don't need to pace decisions. You've done enough holding for one lifetime. Let the image blur gently. The Palatine at dusk. A household settling. Footsteps receding down long corridors. Let the arguments of historians drift somewhere far away, where they can sharpen their words without disturbing your rest. Nothing urgent remains. You can loosen your grip now. You've walked the long path, from necessity to routine, from ambition to endurance, from power to quiet. The story doesn't end with fireworks. It ends with stability, which is the rarest ending of all. And as the night finally closes around that thought, you rest, not as an emperor, not as a symbol, but as someone who stayed, adapted, and shared the weight long enough for others to carry it forward. The pacing slows here, the way breath slows when sleep is close. Images arrive gently now, without edges, a soft glow of oil lamps, the faint sound of water somewhere beyond stone walls. Roam at rest, not silent, but settled. You don't need to follow every thought anymore. You can let them pass, the way clouds pass without needing names. Think of endurance not as effort, but as ease practiced over time. The way a familiar room feels when the lights are low. The way routine becomes comfort. The way companionship can exist without words, without proof, without explanation, just presence, steady and unremarkable in the best possible way. Let your shoulders soften, let your jaw unclench. If your mind drifts back to lamplit streets or quiet gardens, let it. If it drifts somewhere else entirely, that's fine too. Stories don't need conclusions when sleep is waiting. You don't have to remember every detail. You don't have to decide what it all meant. History can argue tomorrow. Tonight is for rest. The city fades into a distant hum. The household quiets. The work is done for now. And as your breathing evens out, you can let go, slowly, comfortably, knowing that nothing needs your attention in this moment. You are allowed to rest.